Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be talking, as you might imagine, a little bit about Afghanistan, but we're going to get into some other topics as well. Bottom of the hour, Michael Knowles will be with us, a new book called Speechless. It is one I've been looking forward to. As a matter of fact, I pre-ordered it myself, and just an incredible work, and we'll get a half an hour with him. He deserves a lot more, but that's what he could give us, so we will take that. Next hour, Jarod O'Flaherty will be with us. We'll talk about a TV series, Vindication. We talked about it once before, but I just thought it would be worth another mention. Oftentimes we're looking for these kinds of films or TV shows that are somewhat faith-affirming. They're not necessarily Christian, but I think they would be interesting to you, and so we like to talk about those kinds of things. And then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. If we don't have it cover it this hour, we will next hour. A piece by Charles Cook, The Bitter Truth. There's still no rhyme or reason to COVID-19. I really thought this was a very significant article, especially a chart that we're going to talk about, and it is available. It's so significant that I, first of all, posted it for our piece to talk about today. Then I decided I would do a commentary on it, which I will record today and it will air next week. And then I got an email from Tim Wildman saying, "Did you see this?" Oh, yes, I did. So I think a lot of people are saying it's pretty significant. So I think we'll get into that in just a minute. But first of all, the last U.S. troops left Kabul airport, and that supposedly, according to the headline, closes out a 20-year war. It doesn't end the war. It just simply says we will no longer talk about an Afghan war, but the war on terror was actually still quite active in some respects, as I said yesterday, and I think there's even more evidence to uphold that. We are in more of a dangerous situation than we were before, because now a group known as the Taliban, working also with ISIS-K and maybe even Al-Qaeda, three different terrorist organizations, have access to an incredible amount of armament, and the impact that can have in the future is significant. So let's not say the war is ended. The war on terror probably never will end in that sense, but it certainly removes that as a theater of operations. The first article is one that I mentioned yesterday and wanted to post today. It is a good piece by Bing West. And before we completely forget about, and I guarantee you the mainstream media is going to work real hard to get you to forget about Afghanistan, because this is obviously a very black mark on the Biden administration and everyone else. It is worth at least a look at how did we get here in the first place. Bing West wrote this. Bing West wrote the book The Wrong War a number of years ago, and this in some respects takes the material from his book and updates it. And if you want to take some notes, again, as I sometimes say, number 1 to 4. Phase 1 goes from 2001 to 2007, and he says that after 9/11, America unleashed a swift aerial blitzkrieg that shattered the Taliban forces. And as a result, many of Al-Qaeda was actually trapped inside what were called the Tora Bora caves in the mountains at that point. And it looked like we could actually move in and eliminate them. Certainly Brigadier General James Mattis, everybody remember him? Mad Dog Mattis, later became, of course, our Secretary of Defense, was ready to cut off the mountain passes and just systematically destroy Al-Qaeda. But instead, General Tommy Franks, the overall commander, sent in troops of Afghan warlords because we wanted to kind of encourage them to actually have some of the fighting and take ownership of this. But they then allowed al-Qaeda to escape into Pakistan. We know, as a matter of fact, that's exactly where Osama bin Laden went there as well. Then, of course, acting upon his beliefs, President George W. Bush, who, when he ran as president in 2000, really was against this idea of nation building, shifted the mission from simply killing terrorists to creating a democratic nation of about 40 million, essentially, tribesmen. I mean, as I've said before, I don't think many in Afghanistan think of it in country terms. They oftentimes think of it more in tribal terms. But certainly on the assumption that there was no threat, we then began to train about 5,000 Afghan soldiers each year. And so that gets you through pretty much most of the Bush administration and takes you to phase two. Phase two is from 2008 to 2013. And again, what he begins to talk about here is that the Democratic leadership had pretty much been criticizing the Republicans about the Iraq war. Because remember, after Afghanistan, we went into Iraq and claimed that a war in Afghanistan was unnecessary. But by default, it sort of implied that Afghanistan was, quote, the right war for Democrats. And of course, now you have newly elected President Barack Obama. And he said Afghanistan was a war that we could not afford to lose. Once you had that statement, all of a sudden, he now ordered a surge of over 30,000 U.S. troops, bringing the total to 100,000 U.S. troops plus 30,000 allied soldiers. And this was a strategy that, again, the author of this, Bing West, mentions in his book, The Wrong War, was a strategy that could not succeed. And he uses the example from Vietnam. But we'll keep the argument going because in many cases, the problem wasn't necessarily the Afghan fighters, many of whom lost their lives. As a matter of fact, I'll give you those numbers in just a minute. But the problem with the chain of command. And so that brings you to phase number 3 from 2014 to 2020. Here's where you had a group of generals, many of them were actually holding sway in powers of all the rest, and they were convinced they could succeed in the area of counterinsurgency and nation building. And of course, then you also have the election, of course, Donald Trump, who at this point really wanted to get rid of this idea of forever wars, and so actually began to move to actually remove American troops, and even announce that sometime in 2021, that would be a time in which we would leave Afghanistan completely. Well, of course, then that brings to phase 4 from the election of now, of course, Joe Biden, and telling us, which is hard to take as seriously, that he was handcuffed or strapped by the Trump decision to remove American troops. I think he wanted to as well. But again, the decision was made to actually try to have all the troops out by the 20th anniversary of 9/11. That got moved up to the end of August. And then things went wrong pretty quickly, as we all know. To be fair, the other day somebody said, well, the Afghan troops never really fought. Well, I think the number I have here is about 60,000 Afghan soldiers did die in defending the country. But we are well aware of the fact that today we have a very sad set of circumstances. And yet it seems more and more likely every day that no one will be held accountable. As we like to do on this program, switch it around. Imagine this happened under the watch of Donald Trump. Would people be talking about impeachment? Would people be calling for the resignation of many of the generals and State Department, Defense Department? I think we know the answer to that. But this is a piece that goes on for many pages, and I went through it fairly quickly. But if you've always wondered, how did we get to where we were in Afghanistan, this may be the best piece I found to give us the history of the Afghan War, which at least technically stopped yesterday. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Years ago, I decided to put together a sermon that dealt with the subject of envy. I wasn't sure I'd ever heard a message on envy, even though it is considered one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, to be fair, I have heard messages on coveting, which, after all, is part of the 10 Commandments. Envy isn't just a biblical subject. Envy is also a political subject. A quarter century ago, Doug Bandow of Cato Institute wrote his book, The Politics of Envy, Statism as Theology. One of his arguments was that citizens filled with envy usually do not want public policy changes so they can get more money. They want to take money away from other citizens who have more than they have. Ann Vanderschot argues in her essay, adapted from her book, that envy is a destructive emotion. The success of a nation to control it, she says, will determine the greatness of that nation. I was struck by the picture they put by her article. Senator Bernie Sanders is speaking to a crowd filled with Bernie signs about the fact that the richest billionaires have so much more money than the rest of America. But consider the irony. Everyone in that audience has food, clothing, shelter, and a bank account. They will go home to apartments or houses that have heating, air conditioning, electricity, appliances, televisions, and much more. While they're being encouraged to envy the rich, they don't even consider that billions of people on this planet would consider anyone in the audience to be incredibly rich. Tomorrow, I'll go into more detail about how envy is used by politicians to advance government programs and tax policy, but don't miss the irony that much of the world would consider Americans wealthier than they could imagine. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In fact, once again, let me just mention before we move on to another topic that at the end of this article, Bing West does suggest a couple of things. And first of all, a course correction inside the Pentagon is sorely needed. You think? The military reputation has been gravely diminished. You start thinking about the impact that this could have on an all-volunteer army. How many people are going to be saying, sure, I want to volunteer so that I can go and fight and then so we can lose a war? How many are going to say, yeah, I want to go fight in the military because, after all, they're identifying the greatest threat right now is white supremacy and things of that nature. So that's an issue, certainly. What about some of the people inside the military that have maybe had very strong reservations about the way this withdrawal was taking place and yet could not necessarily get people higher up in the chain of command to make those kind of decisions? So there's a lot in that first point that he makes, but I'm going to move on to the other two. President Biden's image as a foreign policy expert is tarnished. I think that's obvious. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why he was selected by Barack Obama as his vice president was because he was seen as kind of a foreign policy expert. Barack Obama, a newly elected U.S. senator, couldn't say he had that kind of expertise or that kind of gravitas. But as the Secretary of Defense Robert Gates wrote a while back, Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. This keeps the streak running, I would think. So that's another one. And then finally, this one seems a little odd until you get into it. Number 3, he says, in his farewell address, Washington wrote about the alternative domination of one faction over the other, sharpening by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which is in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, in itself a frightful despotism, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. You're going, what? Anybody who thinks that people in the 18th century weren't very smart, just try to make your way through that particular statement. And the point he was making is this extreme partisanship that it sometimes exists in some respects has led to an inability to have a clear direction. And so when one party of Congress disagrees with another party of Congress and something needs to be done, the president merely steps in and does what he thinks he should do. And so, as he points out, Afghanistan from start to finish was really a White House war, subject to the whims and political instincts of our presidents. And so, whether you look at some of those that were convinced that we should be engaged in nation building, like George W. Bush, or others who were convinced that we needed to withdraw, and that certainly would be Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or those who were convinced that we could at least achieve some level of success in, say, Afghanistan, Barack Obama, you can see that from start to finish, it really was one where we've maybe allowed the commander-in-chief to have more power than maybe was intended. Of course, you have to have a president not dealing with the whims of Congress. But at the same time, it's been a while since we've had any kind of military engagement where everybody has been behind the president. That maybe goes back to Desert Storm, but we haven't certainly with Vietnam, and certainly with Desert Shield, and even with the battles in Afghanistan and Iraq and all the rest had the same kind of agreement. And so it's, again, just another question that needs to be mentioned. He also spends some time talking about certainly supporting those individuals who did serve with distinction. And just before we move on, let me just mention that one of the other stories coming out of this very important removal of most, but not all of the Americans, came from an all-volunteer group known as the American Veterans of the Afghanistan War. And they launched a mission last week in which they were able to actually, with a tremendous amount of cooperation, actually go in and get various families across the wire. They worked in tandem, I might mention, with the U.S. military. They've been dubbed the Pineapple Express, and if you want to type in Pineapple Express, maybe in a Google search, you can read a little bit more about them. But they were most of the time in darkness and under really some dangerous conditions, were able to actually move a number of people inside the wire of the air base, of the airport, I should say, and bring them to the military-controlled side of the airport. And so as a result, they had been able to bring as many as 500 Afghan special operators, assets, and enablers there and handed them over to military protective custody. And, of course, the difficulty also of trying to get some of the Americans there. There has been, of course, a very tacit acknowledgement that we probably have also left Americans behind. And, of course, we'll be talking about that sometime in the future. But before we get to the bottom of the hour with Michael Knowles, I thought I would focus on our other article, which is by Charles Cook. The Bitter Truth, There's Still No Rhyme or Reason to COVID-19. He starts out by saying 2 presidents, 50 states, 195 countries, a multitude of different approaches, and still there's no rhyme or reason to this pandemic. The reason he says that can be seen by, if those of you that are watching online want to see what I'm posting, what we have here is a very interesting chart. And it's a chart I think we are going to see time and time again. And what it does is it lists the COVID death rate per 100,000 by state. Now, again, as I'm holding this up, some of you might not be able to read the fine print, but you can also read and at least see the colors, because the states that are the so-called blue states obviously are in blue, the red states are in red, and if indeed you were to assume that this is all due to Trump supporters or Republicans or conservatives or Christians who aren't doing what they're supposed to do, you would expect that the blue states would all be kind of bunched together and the red states would be bunched together. And there have been a number of people that have made a number of different arguments in that regard. For example, there are people on MSNBC and NBC and others that have said, for example, that really red states are bad, blue states are good. You had Paul Krugman the other day writing in the New York Times, in which he had a little different orientation. He said North is good and South is bad. Well, if you look at this chart, you can see there is just absolutely no way you can come to that kind of conclusion. But Charles Cook puts it this way: if this were true, what could possibly account for the death rate pairings of New York and Mississippi, of Alabama and Connecticut, of Michigan and Arkansas, of Texas and Delaware, of Idaho and Colorado, and points out that for all the criticism that, for example, the governor of Florida has received right now, and the free pass that up until recently was given, for example, to the governors, say, of New York and New Jersey, if you look at those with the highest death rate, those are New York and New Jersey, but number 3 is Mississippi, number 4 is Louisiana, then you work your way down, Massachusetts, you can kind of get the sense very quickly that you have some reds and some blues and some blues and some reds and all of the rest, and that certainly does not fit the meme. If you want to use another state, Oregon, which has had such an incredible number of lockdown times and mask mandates and the rest, is now dealing with an incredible increase in infections. But the one that I think is the best illustration comes outside of the United States. It has to do with Israel. Next week, I should be actually hosting a trip to Israel. That was canceled, as you might know. But if you think about this, Israel has had repeated and really extensive lockdowns. They've had nationwide mask mandates. They've vaccinated just about everybody you needed to vaccinate. The first country in the world that actually was able to fully vaccinate a majority of its citizens was Israel. And now, what do we find? The nation's, one of the world's highest daily, one of the nations, first of all, in the world with the highest vaccination rate, is now one of the world's highest daily infection rates. Nearly 1 in every 150 people in Israel today has the virus. So the point I'm making is one we've made before. The virus is going to be with us. You know, we are never going to get rid of the virus. We've only been able to eliminate a few things like smallpox. Number 2, maybe just a little bit more humility, because trying to figure out what this all means doesn't lend itself easily to red states are bad, blue states are good, north is good, south is bad. And it also, I think, is maybe just a reminder that maybe you shouldn't pay attention to all the spin that has been placed on this idea of COVID-19. Anyway, it's a very interesting piece. I may talk about it a little bit more next hour, but we are going to now have the conversation that we're going to have with Michael Knowles. That's coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we say is he who defines the words can oftentimes win the debate. You're not pro-abortion, you're pro-choice. You're not actually wanting to redefine marriage. It's just basically marriage equality. And so that's why when I heard about the fact that a new book would be coming out called Speechless, that we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And so I pre-ordered the book by Michael Knowles, Speechless: Controlling Minds and Words. And if you're not familiar with Michael Knowles, he, of course, is the host of the Michael Knowles Show, as well as the Daily Wire, the Book Club, an individual that is a graduate of Yale University, and, of course, the author of this book, Speechless. And every time I say that, it seems to ring. Michael, what's going on?
Well, I appreciate your ordering the book, and I appreciate everyone out there who has gotten it, made it a #1 national bestseller, sold more copies than the #1 best-selling book on the New York Times list by about 40%. And, of course, the New York Times snubbed the book from the list, which I think actually proves the point, which we were just discussing.
Anybody who doesn't know the joke, if they watch you, when you were promoting the book, every time you would say the name of the book, we would hear this ding. You'd say Speechless, and then you'd hear a ding. So that's where the joke comes from. And again, I love your sense of humor, but also I want to spend just a little bit of time seeing if we can dig into this book. And I was just thinking back in the 1990s, one of the interviews we did was with an individual, of course, we now know very well, but we were just getting to know him, Dinesh D'Souza, and he wrote a book called Illiberal Education, and he was pointing out the fact that we're moving into a time of political correctness, and really one of the themes that runs through your book is this idea of political correctness. Matter of fact, one of the people I see that you quote quite often is Deborah Cameron, who wrote, of course, that article on the political correctness debate, and isn't that, in some respects, the foundation upon which we're now seeing speech being completely redefined?
Yes, I think that moment when Dinesh wrote Illiberal Education, when Roger Kimball wrote Tenured Radicals, obviously the writing of Deborah Cameron and others, I think that was the moment that political correctness really exploded for the public eye. But I think the phenomenon of political correctness goes back further. I think it goes back not just to the 70s or 80s, but to the 1920s. And I think that it was developed by brilliant leftist theoreticians and politicians who understood that a revolution cannot take place if the revolutionaries cannot get a hold of the common sense. I'm thinking of Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, brilliant Marxist writer, who said that you needed to attain cultural hegemony. You had to infiltrate institutions and then wield that power, wage a war of position, he called it, rather than just a war of maneuver, so that you could turn the culture to your own ends. And I think that developed throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s. We hear a lot about the Frankfurt School and critical theory. Now we hear a lot about critical race theory. Well, one of those critical theorists arises again in the 1960s as the father of the New Left. And this is when the free speech movement really starts to kick off, when the writings of Mao Zedong, another communist, are translated into America, inspiring another generation of students. And I think that here you see the upending of the traditional standards of a society, all in the name of free speech, of course, but the irony is the free speech doesn't last very long. If you look at Berkeley, the free speech movement quickly led into some of the greatest censorship of conservatives that you can see anywhere in the country. And so I think it was always a tool to reorder society. And one of my most terrifying conclusions, I think, when I was writing the book, is that contrary to our own flattery on the right, self-flattery, I think that the left actually understands free speech better than we do. And I think that's how they've been able to manipulate language to their own political advantage for decade upon decade.
About 350 pages, 15 chapters, although about 230 plus pages, plus just an incredible glossary and references and others. And of course, you mentioned Antonio Gramsci. I'm holding up right now our book on critical race theory. We talk about the Frankfurt School, Antonio Gramsci. Of course, we've had those conversations with people like Paul Kenger and others. And another one that you were sort of alluded to, Herbert Marcuse. These are all individuals who we've talked about on this program for some time, but they always were on the periphery. And yet that has changed dramatically. Since I'm the old guy around the table, I can remember during the 1970s and 80s speaking on college campuses and speaking in classrooms. And when I would sometimes be introduced, the professor, who would be a liberal professor, would say, look, you've heard of individuals all through this course, and you've heard my perspective, and I want to give this person a chance to express that point of view. I've seen some of the videos of you on YouTube where you're just maybe even trying to speak at a Young Americans for Freedom event, and you're getting shouted down. So we've moved from a time in which our fellow liberals may disagree with us, but they would still defend our right to communicate, to now this kind of hard left Marxist idea that you have in the book, which says your views aren't even allowed on campus and they're actually quite dangerous.
That's right. And I think, obviously, a lot of this goes back to Marx. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, and I don't want to blame Marx for every evil in the world. But frankly, the man is responsible for a lot of very bad things. And the people who developed PC describe themselves as Marxists who were looking at issues of culture. So we can take their words for it. But I think a lot of responsibility lies with the second wave feminists. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the 70s and 80s are when you really saw this explode. Because what the second wave feminists understood is that the personal is the political. This was one of their slogans. And what they meant by that is political issues are not just the things we debate in the halls of Congress or that we did decades ago. Who does the dishes is a political issue, or at least it should be, or the kind of clothing that you wear, the food that you eat. These are all political issues, or they can be, because what the 70s feminists recognized is what the cultural revolutionaries recognized, that all of those settled aspects of culture, the standards, the mores, the taboos that we all share, that is what we all take for granted, and we sort of debate the issues that are up for public scrutiny. But if you want to radically change the culture, then you have to upend all of those standards, all of those rituals, all of those taboos and mores, which they did. I mean, these days, we fight over our running shoes, we fight over our chicken sandwiches. We cannot even agree on the definition of a man and a woman. You mentioned that I've been shouted down and attacked at schools. The only time I've ever been physically attacked was giving a speech, I kid you not, called "Men Are Not Women," and other uncomfortable truths. And so I think this was very effective. And I know that a lot of conservatives wish we could return to that halcyon bygone era when we all agreed on some basic things and respected one another. But I fear that the left undid that. The left actually did successfully upend those standards. And so I think the only way out is through. I think we need to stand up for a standard. We need to stand up for the natural limits that any society is going to have. And we're going to need to win that political battle before it will settle down again and we can all live in relative harmony.
You know, we've had Jonathan Haidt on this program talking about his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and that's part of the problem because some of the untruths in that book are that you always trust your emotions. Well, what could go wrong there? But also that you aren't just wrong, but you're evil. This tribalism that is existing today suggests that whereas before there was an idea that I may disagree with your view, but I'll listen to it even though I think you're wrong. Now I am convinced that you're evil, which makes it much more difficult to have the kind of civil dialogue that you and I hope could actually take place.
Right. I think a lot of that owes to the fact that we no longer possess the philosophical and religious sophistication to understand what the other person is saying. And I'm being a little diplomatic here because I think actually conservatives do largely understand where the left is coming from. We can't help it. We're living in that culture.
Right.
It's like the air that we breathe. But the left does not really understand where the right is coming from. And actually, Jonathan Haidt, in his own research, has shown this, that the right understands the left pretty well, but the left does not really understand the right. And so they accuse us of all manner of evil. And I think you've seen the arrogance of this secular liberal ideology really reach its apotheosis during the coronavirus epidemic, where we are told that the various whims and caprices of the secular priests, I'm thinking of Dr. Fauci and the other sort of bureaucratic experts, that those are not political at all. I mean, Dr. Fauci regularly says that my decisions and policies are not political, which is obviously a contradiction in and of itself, but they believe that their vision of society is not a philosophy. It doesn't come from certain premises. It just is. It is the common sense truest thing in the world, and no one can object unless they're extraordinarily stupid or extraordinarily evil, and sometimes they accuse us of being both.
That's incredible. Let's take a break, and we'll come back. We'll continue for a few more minutes with Michael Knowles. Again, the Michael Knowles Show, as well as the book club. The book is entitled Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. It is published by Regnery. We have information about that, so you can get it either in hardback or Kindle. But we also, of course, have a link to Michael Knowles' website as well, and I think you're going to find that very helpful because he has other material in addition to, of course, information about his book and, of course, all the clips from his program. Let's continue our conversation with Michael Knowles right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Michael Knowles with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Probably have more time to discuss some of these issues in the next hour, but again, talking about his book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. And I thought we might come to this idea of words that we always sort of thought were just good definitions. They were neutral, but you go back to people like Stanley Fish and others, they're saying, no, you have all sorts of words that are invested with your white supremacy. Deborah Cameron sort of says that. A lot of people have said that over the years. And that would be a surprise to, I think, most of our listeners who say, well, no, a man is a man, a boy is a boy, a girl is a girl, a woman is a woman, abortion is abortion. But the argument is that in this sort of postmodern world, I can redefine the terms, and I'm going to define them in a way that eliminates this hegemony, eliminates some of this white supremacy, eliminates this systemic racism that exists in society.
Yes, and I'm trying to be as generous as I can be to some of these left-wing thinkers, because I think, frankly, one of the reasons that the right has utterly failed to stop political correctness is that we don't take these people seriously. And so many of the arguments they're making seem absurd, and I think that their project is to redefine reality by redefining all of the terms, which is a fool's errand, because ultimately there is such a thing as objective truth, and it will reassert itself whether you like it or not. But when someone like Stanley Fish comes out and says there is no such thing as free speech, at a very basic level, I think the part that he gets right is that all societies have limitations to their speech. In the United States, from the very beginning, has outlawed whole swaths of speech, threats, obscenity, for instance, fighting words, fraud. Our founding fathers did not believe that there was some natural or constitutional right to widespread pornography, even though now many people on the left and the right seem to believe that. And so when we talk about cancel culture, it's obviously a real phenomenon, and conservative and even moderate people are losing their jobs and reputations for saying perfectly ordinary things, such as that a man is not a woman, or that a baby is a baby, or that marriage is between a man and a woman. But I think we need to acknowledge on the right that all cultures cancel. All cultures are going to have some things that are off limits, and when you recognize that there will be such a standard, I think you can get into the game that the left has played, which is they've tried to invert and move and upend those standards. I'm even reminded of William F. Buckley Jr. when he launched the post-war conservative movement with a book called God and Man at Yale. And people forget the subtitle of that book, but it was The Superstitions of Academic Freedom.
Yes.
He called academic freedom a hoax. He said skepticism has utility only when it leads to conviction. And he pointed out, he said, if a Nazi were to be fired from the sociology department at Yale University, no one would decry that event. No one would call that cancel culture, we might say today, because societies, of course, have standards. So I think we need to recognize that there will be limits, that liberty itself requires certain limits. It's not merely licentiousness. Our founding fathers made a big point to recognize that. And so if we can get back to some saner understanding of free speech, I think we'll have a better chance at fighting back against political correctness.
Well, we're talking about that cancel culture. You can think of the G.K. Chesterton quote, thought that stops thought. And that's part of the problem. Yes, I think we can have a rational discussion as to how far free speech goes. And I know you've done that on your program in terms of pornography, in terms of gender reassignment, surgery. We can raise some really fundamental questions about that. But what seems to be happening today is almost back to the Chesterton quote. Once there has been this established orthodoxy, not only are you not allowed to question it, most individuals don't even think about it, don't even think there is a conversation to have about that. And that's one of the problems, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think that it's no coincidence that whenever we see a leaflet or a pamphlet from one of these woke organizations, I think even of the Smithsonian Institute, for some reason, sent out a pamphlet on speech and expression a couple of years ago, and they went after objective truth. They went after reason. They went after logic. And you see it not just at the Smithsonian, but wherever this woke ideology has infected things. And it's no coincidence. The reason is that if we can still rely on objective reality, if we can still rely on our faculties of reason and logic and our moral conscience, then we are necessarily impeding the left's desire and campaign to redefine the whole world according to their own whims. I'm reminded of Whittaker Chambers, the ex-communist who in Witness, he said that communism is not the newest ideology. It's actually the second oldest. It's the great alternative faith of mankind that began in the garden when the serpent told Eve, "Ye shall be as gods." And really the left believes that by changing all of the words, by saying that up is down and black is white and right is wrong, that it really will be so. And we know that that is not the case, but those of us who speak out against it, who contradict the leftist orthodoxy, we can and will be punished, increasingly so.
We're almost out of time, so let me just take one more that I enjoyed. Your trading taboos. The taboos used to be swear words, and you took us through the long history there of what today we would call words that probably are now more permissible on public broadcasting than used to be. And yet we still have other taboos, and it can be anything from, of course, the N-word to smoking and a variety of other topics. And so it isn't necessarily that we have become free. We've just traded taboos, haven't we?
We have, and I think this is the important point that I want to drive home for conservatives, because I think the trap of political correctness is that really, speaking of words that we used to not be able to say on air, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. Because if you go along with the new lexicon, obviously you're giving into them, you're acquiescing. But if you remain stalwart, you say I'm a free speech absolutist, and you give up all of your standards, in a way, you're advancing political correctness just as well, because no one is defending those traditional standards, and nature abhors a vacuum, and so the left standard is going to take its place. And so I think what is important for us is to recognize, in some ways, in many ways, important ways, speech is less free today than it was 50 years ago. In some ways, it's more free. I can say all sorts of naughty words on the air, and I won't get in trouble. What matters, I think, here is the substance. We've been having a lot of procedural and formal debates about free speech in the abstract, but it seems to me that free speech in the abstract doesn't mean anything for people who don't have anything to say. And so I think we need to begin making substantive moral arguments for politics. We need to advance a substantive vision for how we want to live, because if we don't, then the left substantive vision will take its place, as it has for decades.
Michael Knowles has been with us, and we certainly do commend the book to you. It has a lot more words than his previous book, Reasons to Vote for Democrats. The series Vindication, we've mentioned it before. Talked to one of the actors. This time we'll talk to a director, and we'll get into some of that. And then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news, and, of course, open up the phones for your comments and questions, because if nothing else, I know you probably have some things to ask or some comments to make. And if you'd like to do so, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. In that first half hour, I did cover many of the very important articles that we've posted on everything from Afghanistan to COVID-19. My commentary today is on the subject of envy. We'll get into that a little bit later. And I want you to be looking ahead to the fact that we're going to encourage you very shortly, not today, but sometime soon, to take action. And that'll be an action alert for you to be involved with. Let's take a break. We will continue our conversation right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Just before we kind of open it up for some of the discussion, I did want to focus once again on a TV series. We have talked about this before because Vindication is kind of a faith-based crime drama series. And whenever we can talk about any kind of movie or television program that's faith-affirming, that doesn't necessarily mean it's Christian. That's not what we're claiming. But one that maybe you would feel good about. Again, it's a crime series, so I'll let you make some decisions about that. But last time we talked about that, we had in studio with us Todd Terry, and I think we had by phone Peggy Schott. This time we have an opportunity to talk with the producer and director of the Vindication series. That's Jarod O'Flaherty. And this is a crime series that you can actually watch. We talked about season 1. Now we're talking about season 2. And we will have some links that you can find a little bit more about that. But Jarod, first of all, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk about this passion project that has taken the next step forward.
Well, again, we certainly have enjoyed the conversation we had with Todd, but maybe you, better than anybody else, can explain maybe the genesis of that and maybe kind of the mission of what you are trying to communicate as you have developed this now multi-season TV series.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of options out there with faith-based entertainment, and I don't know that our approach is entirely new and different, but the way I approach each episode or each story that we do in Vindication is I want to tell an engaging, interesting story that draws people in, and then God happens to be a part of that, as opposed to the alternative that sometimes people take a message or a sermon and then wrap a story around it. And for audiences, you can kind of see through that sometimes. You realize, the story's kind of weak, but they've got a good message there. And our approach, again, we want good stories that people inside the faith or outside the faith could enjoy what they're following there in the story. But at the same time, there's going to be this faith gospel message that is a part of it in some capacity.
One of the things I appreciate is that this is true both in the Christian realm and the non-Christian realm. So again, I'm not necessarily criticizing one or the other, but you see some of these one-dimensional, two-dimensional characters. And of course, the particular person that Todd Terry plays has got all sorts of issues. And that, I think, rings true as well, because you want a good story, you want a little bit of investigative work, and at the same time, you want the complexity of the characters to mean something so that you get fully invested and involved in that particular series. And I know you really strive to flesh out those characters, haven't you?
Absolutely. When you have one-dimensional characters, it kind of loses the it's not as interesting because you know what they're going to do and how they're going to respond. If someone always has the right answers, they always know the right thing to say, then as a viewer, as you're watching that, you kind of know what to expect. Okay, this guy's going to solve the crime. He's going to arrest the bad guy, and everybody's going to be happy. But when you have multidimensional characters, it keeps you on the edge of your seat because you don't know, given a particular situation, how that character is going to respond. And, of course, that's real life. None of us are one-dimensional where we're all the same thing all the time. We have our ups and downs, our peaks and our valleys. So we try to capture that and show characters in a realistic sense, as opposed to, good guys and bad guys and everyone is black and white and you know exactly what's going to happen with them.
Let's, Dave, if we can talk about maybe the value of a TV series. We had this conversation the other day with Dallas Jenkins and The Chosen, because I was pointing out, and he agreed, that you don't try to resolve every issue in every episode, because you have a chance to sometimes have an issue raised in, say, episode 3 that may not even be completely resolved or even thoroughly vetted out until maybe episode 7 of the second year. And there is a sense in which you have a little more freedom with a TV series than you do with a movie that lasts 2 hours or less.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not confined that, okay, we've got to wrap up and solve everything. There are things that we introduce in season 2, which is premiering today or tomorrow on PureFlix, which is why we're here talking about it. But we have things in season 2 that we raise that don't get answered. So if we get a season 3 and we keep going, we're going to have the opportunity to continue and explore those. But yeah, in a film, you typically don't have that liberty unless you know you're going to be doing a trilogy or something. So it's great that we get to do that, and that adds that depth to the characters that you're talking about and to the storylines, that new things get introduced that leave you wondering and on the edge of your seat and wanting to see what happens next.
Well, let's, if we can, since you just mentioned it, the reason we're doing this is because now people can watch the season 2. And it is amazing that whenever we talk about some of these that are not on broadcast television, they always say, well, what channel is it on? I go, no, you don't understand. So explain for a few minutes how actually people can watch these episodes. They can go back and binge watch, of course, the first season. Of course, they are just about ready now to watch the second season. So talk about the way in which our listeners can actually watch these series.
Right. Well, obviously, since we're doing season 2, the best thing to do is to go and watch season 1. That way you're up to speed on all the characters. PureFlix, which is a streaming service of faith and family content, not unlike Netflix, but they just focus on content that's more family friendly. They do have mature subjects, but they're not gratuitous. They don't go overboard. And there's typically a faith element to most all the entertainment. So PureFlix, season 2 is a PureFlix original series. So they picked it up to be exclusive on their network. One of our other partners, Redeem TV, which is a donation-based streaming service, again, kind of like PureFlix or Netflix, they also are a production partner, and you can watch on there as well. So PureFlix and Redeem TV are the 2 main places we like to send audiences to. You can just sit down on the couch, stream it. It works with most any TV. There's also an app on your phone you can get, and that's where you can watch the series. We also have, traditional where you can go and buy it on Amazon and watch it there, or the DVDs, those as well. But we're just excited that, there aren't a whole lot of, you mentioned Dallas Jenkins and The Chosen, there aren't a whole lot of Christian series that go past a season or 2. So for us to be in the second season, it's really been a great opportunity.
It sounds like good writing and a good opportunity to get back into the series. And of course, we had Todd Terry and Peggy Schott with us the other day. We need to take a break, and I'm sure you can stay with us for just a little bit longer and maybe talk a little bit about some of the backstory, because if we want to get people up to speed on season 2, maybe you can tell us a little bit about season 1, which before we wanted to not necessarily go and provide too many spoilers. So that is something I thought we could do after the break. But if you find yourself saying, okay, I didn't even know about this series. Yeah, you did talk about it before, but didn't go around to watching it. We have a link at our website at pointofview.net. You can first of all look at the picture of Jarod, and that will take you to one of the websites called vindicationseries.com. So there's some information there. We also have another one you can link at as well, which actually gives you just kind of an overview. So there are 2 links for you to follow, and either one or both of those will provide you with the opportunity to watch this. We'll come back and we'll talk about a few things that might be there in terms of any parental advisory, but from time to time we like to talk about those kinds of faith-affirming kinds of movies or television shows. We thought you'd like to know about that. That's why we're covering it, and we'll continue with Jarod right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You're Years ago, I decided to put together a sermon that dealt with the subject of envy. I wasn't sure I'd ever heard a message on envy, even though it is considered one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, to be fair, I have heard messages on coveting, which, after all, is part of the 10 Commandments. Envy isn't just a biblical subject. Envy is also a political subject. A quarter century ago, Doug Bandow of Cato Institute wrote his book, The Politics of Envy, Statism as Theology. One of his arguments was that citizens filled with envy usually do not want public policy changes so they can get more money. They want to take money away from other citizens who have more than they have. Ann Vandershot argues in her essay, adapted from her book, that envy is a destructive emotion. The success of a nation to control it, she says, will determine the greatness of that nation. I was struck by the picture they put by her article. Senator Bernie Sanders is speaking to a crowd filled with Bernie signs about the fact that the richest billionaires have so much more money than the rest of America. But consider the irony. Everyone in that audience has food, clothing, shelter, and a bank account. They will go home to apartments or houses that have heating, air conditioning, electricity, appliances, televisions, and much more. While they're being encouraged to envy the rich, they don't even consider that billions of people on this planet would consider anyone in the audience to be incredibly rich. Tomorrow, I'll go into more detail about how envy is used by politicians to advance government programs and tax policy, but don't miss the irony that much of the world would consider Americans wealthier than they could imagine. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue the conversation for a few more minutes with Jarod O'Flaherty as we again talk about the Vindication series. And before we do so, I remember reading in the Baptist Standard, I think you grew up in a Baptist church in Burleson, Texas, not so far from where we're broadcasting today. Most of our listeners live in states outside of Texas, but for those of us in Texas, we kind of know where that was. And I think that, interestingly enough, was one of the reasons you did a film, because that film, We Were There, was kind of a documentary. And if I remember right, wasn't that a promise that you kept to your grandmother? Because you were going to videotape your grandfather, I think, about his World War II experiences. So in some respects, you have been involved in other kinds of projects. In that case, a documentary. Of course, your other film, My Son, before you even got into Vindication. Isn't that background pretty accurate?
Yeah, if that was from memory, that was well done, because, you said it all perfectly. I had a grandfather who was in the Navy in World War II in the South Pacific, and in 2010, my grandmother had been asking me for many years to record him telling his stories because, she knew I did video stuff, and she happened to pass away around that time before I had done it. It really triggered, hey, I need to do this now, and instead of putting it off. So that was kind of what started. Once I did the documentary, the idea came about, well, if we can do a full-length documentary, why not a film, not unlike what the Sherwood brothers or the Sherwood Church in Georgia and the Kendrick brothers, what they had done. So that's kind of what got things in motion. And now here we are with Vindication doing multi-seasons, and it's on multiple continents now.
And again, I've been very encouraged to see how many have developed through their churches. Of course, we're talking about the one in Burleson, but we mentioned some other situations where people have used this. And so this may be just a great opportunity for even some listeners out there that say, I have a story to tell, and now it is much easier with some of the technology that we have in terms of not only shooting the picture, but now editing it to produce something that would really have a very significant impact. So I just wanted to use your story, starting from a church there. We have many other examples like that being developed, and I just really think it's very encouraging, and maybe would be an encouragement to some other future filmmaker as well. But for just a few minutes, can you give us a little bit of the story of Vindication? We didn't go into it last time with Todd simply because it didn't want to be a spoiler, but if people are going to be up to speed on season 2, can you tell us a little bit about what has already happened in season 1?
Sure. Yeah, and you said that correctly. Before season 1 came out, you didn't want to say anything. You wanted audiences to catch it, but it's been out for about 2 years now, so we can dig into it. Well, season 1 follows a detective. It's Todd Terry's character named Detective Travis, and in each episode, he's investigating a different case. Some of them deal with relevant, issues. One is a gentleman that has autism or something like that, and some community members are kind of treating him poorly because of his differences. There's another episode that deals with teenagers and the content they were sending each other on their cell phones. There's another episode that deals with what people say trafficking or exploitation. So anyway, each episode kind of has a different topic, but you're following the same detective. And in each episode, in some form or fashion, the thumbprint of God shows up, whether it's the person being accused has a strong faith, maybe it's the victim. It could be, it's all different ways throughout these. And this detective, he's not necessarily a believer. I kind of think of him as an Easter and Christmas believer. He'll go to church on those days, he'll bow his head occasionally, but it's not the guiding force in his life. But as these cases continue to just stack on one another, he gets to a point where he's like, okay, something is going on here, because every case I investigate, something about God keeps popping up. And his wife is a strong believer, and she sees what is going on, and she's obviously excited about it, that, hey, God is pursuing you. And once we get to the end of season 1, because of all these things that have been happening, he eventually comes to a point of really needing to make a firm decision on where his faith lies. So at the very end of the season, you see something happen with that. And as we go into a season 2, he's changed as a person now. He does have faith in his life that is guiding his decisions. So now you get to see him put in another string of 10 or so cases and having to see how he responds in each of those. So that's kind of the high level of what happens in season 1 and then where we go in season 2.
Well, again, let's, if we can, help our parents out there. Someone might say, okay, any parental advisory? First of all, we're talking about crime, and so you're going to see everything at least discussed, from lust to sexuality to violence to death and mayhem and a variety of others. So obviously that's the case, but it seems to me that you're trying to be very careful so that this is not offensive to an individual that decided to follow the series in ways that, unfortunately, sometimes those without any kind of parameters or barriers might actually do in some of the broadcast television that deals with crime and drama.
Correct. Yeah. We've tried to take the word I like is tasteful, that we've tried to take a tasteful approach in how we tell these stories, so that you're not going to have images or thoughts that get seared into your mind, whether you're 13 or even much older, by what we put on the screen. But at the same time, we are addressing tough topics, and we want them to be memorable. So, there are times that we get very close, where all the adults in the room know what's happening. We're just not going to go overboard and splash it on your screen of exactly what's happening or what's going on. So that's really our approach. In my household, I have 3 teenage daughters. In our family, we don't use words like dumb and stupid. We didn't watch shows like SpongeBob and other things along those lines when we were growing up. But I let them watch this series because it does have realistic, relevant topics that are discussed, and they need to know about. I can't shelter them forever and act like this stuff doesn't go on in the world. They need to know about it, but just in a tasteful manner where I don't, as a parent, want to hide or grab the remote because it's, what my children are seeing.
Well, again, it takes on a lot of really tough issues that we talk about so often here on the program, and so I wanted people to know about that. One last time, some of the people that are listening, and many of our listeners might just be saying, okay, explain again how I can watch this on my TV at home or on my laptop computer or something of that nature. Where do they go?
Yeah, pureflix.com is the easiest. You go in, they have like a free subscription where you can sign up for a week or so, don't have to pay anything, and you can go and watch it there. The other option, redeemtv.com. You can go there. Both of them have apps, and you just pull it up on your phone, stream it to your TV like you would other programs on Disney or Netflix or Hulu or whatever.
And again, vindicationseries.com, that has the link to Redeem TV. And of course, the other one, of course, is PureFlix, which we've talked about before. So, Jarod, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View. And again, not too many times when you launch a TV series, you're in season 2. So congratulations for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope people check it out. Maybe we'll get a season 3, get to keep going. We're also on Facebook and Instagram for people that do those things. And that's where we post a lot of updates and interviews and things of that nature.
Let me just mention, we do have that link. As a matter of fact, we just posted it on the screen if you happen to be watching. But we have the link to Facebook, and we have Twitter, and of course we have the web page. So all sorts of great information. And again, Vindication. Just thought you might want to know about that. Sometimes the biggest complaint I have from people is, well, there's just nothing good to watch. Well, this would be something that would be kind of interesting to see, kind of the spiritual pilgrimage taking place right now by an individual who doesn't necessarily start out as a Christian, but we begin to get the sense that maybe some of these things will have an impact on his life. And so maybe fun for your kids to watch, might even be an evangelistic opportunity if one of your neighbors got watching it as well. Let's take a break, and when we come back, the last half hour, we're going to get into some issues, but let me just mention real quickly that my commentary today is on the subject of envy. You might say, where did that come from? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, years ago, it occurred to me that I'd never heard a sermon on envy, and I decided to put one together. To be fair, I have heard some on coveting, because that's obviously in the 10 Commandments, but envy is certainly one of the 7 deadly sins, and I'd never really heard anything on that. But envy is not just a political subject, as I point out here. It's not just a biblical subject, it's a political subject. Because in some respects, people have been talking about the fact that to actually advance the size and scope of government, we oftentimes have to use envy. So I quote from Ann Hendershot, who actually has an essay that is based on her book, talking about how envy has been used to kind of advance an agenda. And it was interesting that in the article that we have linked to it, they have a picture, and the picture is of Bernie Sanders speaking to a crowd filled with Bernie Sanders signs, fuel the burn, in which he's talking about the rich billionaires who have so much more money than the rest of us. And I just said, first of all, think of the irony in that regard, because yes, these individuals don't have the kind of money as some of these very wealthy people, but every one of those people holding a sign, when the rally was over, went back to basically an apartment or a house where they had air conditioning and heating and electricity and appliances and televisions and cell phones. And in some respects, from the world's point of view, they were incredibly rich, but nevertheless, they were being motivated to support him because of envy. Anyway, that's one of the articles we have posted on the website. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. I've covered a lot of different issues, but I thought I would come back real quickly to this one by Charles Cook, because I did the best I could in the short amount of time that I had, and I've oftentimes said there's always 3 radio programs you do: the one you think you're going to do, the one you do, and the one you wish you did. So there's probably a sense in which I left some things out, so I want to get into that a little bit more detail. But first of all, it's a piece that I think might have some staying power, some legs, if you will, because it's just a reminder that if nothing else, we need to be a little bit more humble as we start our way into this next year of maybe lockdowns and mandates and passports and all of the rest. And for those of you that, again, watching online, a lot of it centers around this little diagram that I'm holding up. Now, you can't necessarily read the words, but that's why you want to go to the 3rd article on our website. But if you can see anything, you can see red and blue. Now, the blue on the very top with the highest death rate per 100,000, New Jersey, New York. But then you come to Mississippi, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Arizona, Alabama, Connecticut. You've got a mixture there. If you say that they're all northern states are good, southern states are bad, no, that doesn't fit. Blue states are good, red states are bad, no, that doesn't work. Even the ones on the bottom, Hawaii, which is very understandable because they pretty much had to lock down that particular island, Vermont, Alaska, Maine, Oregon. I'm going to come back to Oregon in just a minute. But the point that he is making is there's no rhyme or reason. He says, we've had 2 presidents, 50 states, 195 countries, all sorts of different approaches, and nothing really seems to stand out. And the point that he makes early on is that the New York Times the other day, to their credit, ran a piece in which they were talking about the spike in, and again, I got to make a distinction sometimes between infections and deaths. The chart I was showing is deaths, but a spike in infections. But then they said very quickly, even a state that has made a major push for vaccinations can be crushed by the Delta variant. Well, what happened is the reaction to that was off the charts, and he just gives you a few examples of that. For example, MSNBC's Kyle Griffin said, "This is not true. You know it. Do better." Soledad O'Brien went so far as to say this was journalistic malpractice. And the point he was making is that if you are a liberal and you have in your mind that red states are bad, blue states are good, then you just reject any of the statistics that actually challenge your view. We all live in a tribe, and we've talked about tribalism today, even with Michael Knowles. But the, if you will, the bubble that liberals live in is a little more hermetically sealed sometimes than what conservatives live in. Then he quotes from Paul Krugman, who in the New York Times said, well, no, really what it is the northern states are good and the south is bad. And that's where, of course, he then raised the question. How do you explain then the pairing between New York and Mississippi, Alabama and Connecticut, Michigan and Arkansas, Texas and Delaware, Idaho and Colorado? And so let me just use 2 states where we broadcast, which are in the news. Florida, because there has just been this constant drumbeat against the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, because they are in the press see him as the potential running, either the running mate or the odds-on candidate in a couple of years for the presidency. And so we'll look at Florida and then compare it to Louisiana, because our heart is right now for those in Louisiana, in New Orleans in particular. And Charles Cook does a very good job of, first of all, saying that the vaccination rate for Florida is above the national average, and Florida has a disproportionately high older populations. Matter of fact, I think I looked it up here. It has the largest senior population in the country. Okay? So it is number 1 in terms of elderly, and yet also has a very high vaccination rate. Yet it's near the bottom half in terms of deaths among senior citizens. Okay? You wouldn't know that if you were to read Many of the other articles, not this one I'm giving credit to in the New York Times that told the truth, but many other New York Times articles, Washington Post articles, various things that appear in Solon and Mother Jones and all sorts of other places, CNN. By contrast, let's look at the state of Louisiana, because, of course, we are now looking at some of this before the hurricane hit. But in New Orleans, and in particular the city of New Orleans, they have a system right now of vaccine passports. And its death rate is the 4th worst in the nation, while Florida, with a much older population, sits in about 20th place. And if you say, well, maybe it's the senior population, again, looking this up, Florida is number 1, Louisiana is 42nd. So he then gives some other examples. Oregon is one of those, which up until now has had a much lower incidence of infection and death, but now itself is beginning to have some problems, because just the other day in the state of Oregon, they started now organizing refrigerated trucks to hold the bodies of those individuals that are in Oregon that are dying. So, and of course, and I gave you the one from Israel, and the Israel one is a little different because it's really talking about infections versus deaths. But the bottom line is that we can go through all of these details, but the point I think you should really take away from that is, number one, we don't know as much as we think we know. And so a lot more humility will go a long way. We have a real need right now to make sure that we do understand the fact that in some cases we don't have all the facts. We can't necessarily explain everything as well. And there has been a tremendous amount of spin, both by President Donald Trump, some by certainly Joe Biden, a lot by politicians on both sides of the aisle, and especially by the media. And if there's one thing we've wanted to pass on to you here at Point of View, is to begin to identify the spin that is a political spin placed on some of these conversations being had about the issue of public health. So I did want to post this one because it is, I think, illustrative of the fact that there's a lot that we don't know. And it's okay to say that we don't know. And this assumption that by locking down the particular state, locking down this particular community is going to prevent infections has just not exactly worked out very well, because you can see some of these states which have been almost like the poster child for lockdowns, mandates, and everything else that have very high death rates, and others which came out of lockdowns very early, don't have vaccine passports, don't have mask mandates, which are sometimes near the top and sometimes in the middle, even sometimes down in the bottom. I think there's some other factors, which I think if you look at this chart, you can figure out. Some of those have to do with the fact that population density, very significant. It's if you look at the ones at the top, New Jersey, New York, lots of population density there. Look at some of the bottom, Alaska, Maine, Vermont. Not so much population density. So there's some issues there, but as soon as you start saying that, well, you see that Montana, that's certainly, or Wyoming, where you would have much less population density, are much further up on the chart. So every time you try to come up with a factor, you can find some exceptions. And when you have as many exceptions as you have rules, at this point, maybe you should not pay attention to people making those rules, and in particular should recognize that there has been a lot of spin, and maybe it's time to ignore some of that spin. Just before we take a break, let me mention that we have not posted today, but I know it's coming, in which we're going to encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, click on that button that says Take Action, and we're going to encourage you to contact your 2 United States senators about H.R. 4, because this is a piece of legislation that has passed the House, has gone to the Senate, and in many ways is similar to H.R. 1, which we've encouraged you to contact your senators about. But it is a little different because in this particular case, it doesn't necessarily do away instantaneously with all the state election laws, but it gives that authority to the Justice Department to do pre-clearance, and in some respects may be just as dangerous, and yet it's sometimes seen as a moderate or compromise piece of legislation. And so that's why we're going to, in the future, first of all, educate you about that, and then second of all, encourage you to contact your 2 United States senators about that. So I did just want to give you kind of a preview of coming attractions, and that is one of the action items that you will see on our website. And when it's up there, I hope you'll take the time to click on the button, express your opinion to your 2 United States senators, because that vote, no doubt, is going to come, and we certainly have concerns about it, and we'll talk more about that. But I need to take a break. I'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Matt, for a few more minutes, if nothing else, I'd like to try to end with some positive things. But the reason we need this is because of the sadness. I mean, it seems like everywhere I go right now, as you would imagine, the flags are at half-mast. And we understand that because when it's at half-staff, that illustrates the death of of course, the 13 military personnel, which is a small portion of all that will die under the Taliban regime. And you think of the fact that today, the 31st, is supposed to be the end of the military engagement in Afghanistan, since, of course, we're hours later, that's already taken place. And then you go to some of these bars and restaurants, and how many times have we seen a table set with 13 empty places, sometimes including 13 drinks? And of course, you have others which have posted the names of those fallen. And again, the sadness of all of this has really affected me. I'll certainly try not to cry, because that's not something we need on radio, but it has been so disheartening is the only word you can come up with when you realize what this has meant in terms of the loss of life, the investment of treasure and time and lives, first in Iraq and in Afghanistan, kind of the end of a failed mission from the beginning. And it is hard to kind of find any positives. So let me come back to a couple of positive things that I'd like to talk about. One that I just mentioned at the outset of the program, but I know most people don't listen to the entire program, so maybe you didn't hear me talk about the fact that there was a volunteer group called the American Veterans of the Afghan War. And last Wednesday, a week ago, they actually worked to try to bring in as many individuals as they could. And so they were really trying to help what we would call at-risk Afghan elite forces and their families to try to bring them to safety. Some people refer to them as the Pineapple Express, and they mostly launch their rescues at night. And so in the pitch black darkness, because there's not much light there at the airport, as you might imagine, and under incredibly dangerous conditions. I mean, you have the Taliban, you have ISIS-K, you may have even had some Al-Qaeda there. They were working unofficially in tandem with the U.S. military and American embassy. They were able to move people inside the wire into the military-controlled side of the Hamid Karzai International Airport. And the group, even as late as Thursday, were all able to have been able to bring as many as 500 Afghan special operators, assets, enablers with their families into the airport and fly them out. And so this is, again, if nothing else, a opportunity to salute those people which were part of the Pineapple Express. They were oftentimes called the Task Force Pineapple. They had began to try to rescue some of the commandos in the past being hunted by the Taliban. And even to this day, we wonder if there are still, I suspect that there are, Americans and certainly many Afghanis that have helped us whose lives are in danger. Another way to look at this is to quote from our friend Gary Bauer. He says, he starts his piece by saying 300. He says that's the best estimate of how many Americans are likely to have been left behind in Afghanistan. Just think of that, 300 left behind. No one knows for sure. He says unofficially about 117,000 people have been airlifted out of Afghanistan. The overwhelming majority of them are Afghan refugees, many without any paperwork. And I think if we don't do a good job of vetting, I would suspect that most are going to be great citizens of America. But mixed in with them, no doubt, are some that actually intend us harm. There were some suggesting that by actually pulling American passports or others, they would actually get on a flight and thus be able to develop a terrorist cell. But he then goes on to talk about, again, some of the positives, because he talks about hundreds of veterans and special forces members organized massive independent rescue operations because the government was not doing enough to do so. Even to this line that we heard yesterday, well, these are Americans that did not make it into the airport. Well, guess what? It's pretty hard to make it into the airport when the Taliban is beating you or even trying to pull your passports. So that's the case. Gary Bauer goes on to say that a number of Christian ministries like Samaritan's Purse were also involved. And he says, we'll really never know how many Americans they saved. He said one of the heroes running such an operation said he was contacted by someone very high up in the government, someone most Americans would recognize, who was privately asking if they could get more people out, which is a sad commentary. Think about this. You have somebody in the government contacting an independent contractor, a former Special Forces member, maybe with the Pineapple Express, maybe working with Samaritan's Purse, whatever it might be. And the Biden administration claims right now that they have a lot of leverage over the Taliban, but we will find this out now in the next few days. And he says, it seems to me that we have a lot of leverage. They have a lot of leverage over us. They specialize in hostage taking. Why wouldn't they just use these 300 Americans as leverage? So we will see what happens there. And of course, then there has been all the reports about the drone strike, because the comment was, well, the drone strike was one that took out 2 of the ISIS-K individuals. And as Britt Hume and a couple of others said just the other day, you'd have a little more credibility if you told us the names of the 2 that you did take out, but we haven't, at least as last time I looked, hadn't seen those names. And Glenn Greenwald points out that you had all sorts of people in the press who were assuring us that there were no civilian casualties, and said this with complete dogmatism, which they wouldn't have said if it was a Trump administration operation. And, of course, now we know that that was not the case as well. So in the midst of just the human tragedy, it has been also becoming more and more obvious that not only the administration, but many in the press have just not been telling the truth. And if there's one thing we are trying to encourage you to do, is to have some level of discernment and check out and be skeptical of and question some of the things being said every single day. So again, that's just an attempt to at least acknowledge that there were some individuals who didn't wait for the government to act, actually went in there under the moniker of the Pineapple Express and saved lives. And 16 years ago, we had Hurricane Katrina, and I remember broadcasting from these same microphones in a different studio, saying that even though many times we weren't necessarily getting the government to show up right away to some of those individuals that needed food, clothing, shelter, protection, maybe even a boat to get them out of the floodwaters, we had lots of churches, even in this area, that simply packed up a U-Haul truck, went down, and long before FEMA or anybody else showed up, it was churches that showed up. And so I still believe in the goodness of Americans, and I thank those individuals that risked their lives to save others. But we are now in for a long, difficult set of circumstances created because we turned over so much armament to the Taliban that this will be a battle for terrorism that will last for a long, long time, I suspect. Let's take a break. We need to do so. We hope that you will join us tomorrow here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.